It was one of those evenings where the dining room looked like it had been staged for a magazine cover. Gregory and Simone had insisted on hosting Sunday dinner, and I didn't argue. Their long oak table was set with candles, polished silver, and too much food for a family of 6. My younger son Marcus had come with his wife and kids, and Walter, Simone's father, took his usual seat at the head of the table he believed belonged to him. I sat opposite, quiet as always, watching. The meal started like any other. Walter wasted no time reminding me of his successes, boasting about old banking deals while sliding digs about how I'd only been a construction man. He thought those barbs cut deep, but they didn't. I had stopped caring years ago. What I cared about now was the way Simone hovered by my chair, too attentive, too careful with her smile. She carried 2 glasses in her hands and placed one in front of me with deliberate flair. "A special cocktail for my favorite father-in-law," she said, eyes gleaming. Everyone chuckled politely, except Marcus, who kept his head down. I lifted the glass, tilted it, and pretended to admire the way the light hit it. But I wasn't admiring. I was studying. The faint swirl on the surface told me more than enough. Walter leaned back in his chair, still chuckling at his own stories, oblivious to what was happening around him. No one noticed when I shifted my hand, sliding my untouched drink closer to him. Simone was busy topping off Gregory's plate. The kids were fighting over cornbread. It was easy. Walter, without hesitation, reached for the glass I'd left by his elbow, assuming it was his. He raised it in a mock toast, smirked at me, and drained half in a gulp. I sipped water and chewed slowly on roasted chicken. Nothing about my face betrayed the switch. For a while, the conversation carried on as if nothing had happened. Simone's voice floated across the table, too light, too casual. I watched her glance at me every few minutes, waiting for something, anything. I gave her nothing. Instead, I leaned back, nodded at Gregory's story about work, and kept my eyes on Walter. It started small. He rubbed his temples and asked if anyone else thought it was hot in the room. No one else did. 10 minutes later, his words began to slur. Simone stiffened in her chair. Gregory asked if he was okay, but Walter waved him off, blaming the wine. By the 20-minute mark, he could barely keep his fork steady. When his hand trembled so hard that mashed potatoes slid off his plate, the table fell silent. Then came the 30-minute mark. Walter's eyes rolled, and he slumped forward, his glass tipping over and spilling across the table. Simone shot to her feet, knocking her chair backward. "Dad!" she screamed, her voice cracking. Gregory rushed to help, while Marcus stood frozen, his kids clinging to his arm. I stayed seated, calm, steady, watching the panic unravel around me. Simone kept shouting about medication, begging for someone to call an ambulance. Gregory fumbled with his phone. The kids cried. Chairs scraped. It was chaos. I folded my napkin neatly, set it beside my plate, and rose slowly. My hands didn't shake. My breathing was even. While everyone scrambled, I walked around the table, lifted Walter's arm off the spilled drink, and helped ease his body upright until Gregory could hold him steady. I said nothing more than, "Let's keep him upright until help arrives." The sirens came quick. Neighbors must have heard the commotion, and within minutes, paramedics were at the door. They lifted Walter onto a stretcher, Simone clinging to his side, Gregory pacing in circles. The children were ushered into the living room. As they rolled Walter out, Simone's eyes darted to me. There was something in her stare, panic, suspicion, maybe even fear. I gave her the same look I'd given her when she placed that drink in front of me. Blank, unreadable. The door shut behind them, leaving the house heavy with silence. The plates of half-eaten food sat cooling on the table. The candles flickered, and I stood in the middle of it all, calm as stone. Dinner was over. The paramedics moved quickly, strapping Walter down as Simone clutched his hand like she'd just watched her world collapse. Her voice trembled, too loud, too frantic, drawing every eye in the room. He's been on blood pressure meds. Maybe it's a bad interaction. Please, you have to hurry. She kept repeating it over and over like she needed everyone to hear it and accept it. Gregory hovered, useless in the corner, pacing and rubbing the back of his neck. His wife's performance seemed to have paralyzed him, unsure if he should follow the ambulance or stay with the children. Marcus, ever steady, took charge of his nieces and nephews, guiding them to the back room and shutting the door on their cries. That left me standing with Simone, her father, and two medics who had heard these kind of stories too many times before. Walter's pulse was weak, but steady enough that they didn't rush. The senior medic asked questions in clipped tones. What did he eat? Any new medications? Did he drink alcohol? Simone supplied answers so fast they stumbled over one another, as though she'd prepared them in advance. Just wine with dinner. He takes lisinopril. Yes, he ate chicken and vegetables. Nothing out of the ordinary. Please, please, he has a history of fainting spells. Her words painted the picture of a worried daughter. To anyone else, it might have seemed convincing, but I caught the way her hands trembled only when the medics looked her way. The moment they turned back to Walter, her face tightened, her mouth pulling flat, her eyes sharp as glass. Then she noticed me watching. In a split second, the performance returned, quivering lip, wringing hands, tears brimming. I stepped back, gave the medics room, and kept my silence. Gregory finally decided to ride along, fumbling his coat on and hurrying to the door. Simone followed, her voice trailing down the hall as she swore she'd meet him at the hospital. Before she left, she paused. Her gaze swept the dining room, the overturned glass still wet on the table, her eyes flicking to mine for just a moment too long. I didn't flinch. I simply nodded toward the door as if urging her to go. She did. The sirens faded into the night. The house fell hollow without the chaos. Just Marcus and me left at the table with untouched plates and cooling food. He said nothing, only gave me a look, the kind that asked questions he didn't want answered in front of his children. I patted his shoulder, told him to tend to the kids, and cleared my plate into the sink. Alone in the kitchen, I rinsed the dish and set it on the rack. My eyes drifted to the faint ring of condensation left where the original glass had been placed in front of me. A small detail, gone in a matter of minutes, but one I wouldn't forget. Simone's panic act hadn't fooled me. It hadn't even been for me. It was for everyone else, for Gregory, for the medics, for any neighbor who might have been listening when the ambulance pulled up. She wanted a story that made sense, a clean explanation to cover a mess she hadn't expected. I wiped the counter, dried my hands, and leaned against the sink. 30 minutes earlier, she had set a trap with a smile. Now, she was riding to the hospital beside the man who had walked straight into it. That was all the confirmation I needed. Long before that night, at the dinner table, Walter had made it his mission to remind me of my place, or at least the one he thought I belonged in. Every family gathering became an opportunity for him to sharpen his tongue at my expense. At birthdays, he would raise his glass and make a joke about how I probably built half the city, but never owned a piece of it. On Christmas mornings, while my grandchildren tore into wrapping paper, he'd remind Gregory and Marcus in front of everyone that real wealth is made in banks, not on construction sites. He thrived on the little cuts, the kind that left no obvious wound but festered all the same. I knew his type, a man who measured himself against others constantly, and when he found a weakness, or thought he did, he pressed until it became a scar. For years, I let it slide. My sons were watching. My grandchildren were watching. If I fired back, I'd be the bitter old man. So I smiled, nodded, and let Walter talk himself taller. Simone learned quickly from her father. Where Walter used blunt humiliation, Simone preferred control through subtlety. She never attacked outright. Instead, she guided conversations, redirected attention, and made sure her voice lingered just a bit louder than mine whenever decisions were discussed. At Thanksgiving, she would insist on rearranging the seating to make it easier, but somehow that always meant placing me at the far end, a spectator instead of participant. When financial matters surfaced, she leaned in with authority. Gregory, and I think it's best if, always starting with their decision, never asking my opinion. Even Marcus, who saw through her polished smiles, grew cautious about challenging her in front of others. She spoke as if she already held the authority she was slowly carving out. At first, I thought it was nothing more than youthful confidence. A daughter-in-law eager to prove herself, perhaps to please her husband or defend him against his louder relatives. But as the years went by, I saw the pattern deepen. Walter would deliver the blow, Simone would smooth the edges, and Gregory would remain silent, as though caught between loyalty to his wife and his father. Family dinners became less about togetherness and more about hierarchy. Walter at one end, booming with stories of markets and mergers. Simone nearby, drawing lines of conversation that circled around her and Gregory. I became the quiet listener, not by choice, but by force of their presence. The more I stepped back, the bolder they grew. There were times Marcus would catch my eye across the table, his expression a quiet apology. He knew, he saw, but he also knew the danger of speaking up. Simone's grip on Gregory had grown too tight, and Gregory's dependence on her approval too consuming. To challenge her would have been to fracture the family in a way Marcus wasn't ready to risk. It was arrogance in its purest form, disguised as charm and confidence. Walter puffed himself up with his past, while Simone crafted a future that revolved around her influence. And the more they succeeded in pushing me to the margins, the more convinced they became that I would never resist, never retaliate, never hold my ground. I endured it all quietly. I laughed when they expected me to laugh. I held my tongue when they expected silence. I let them believe their words rolled off me like water, that their power plays left no impression. But I remembered every jab, every seating arrangement, every time Simone ended a conversation with "we've already decided." By the time Simone placed that special cocktail in front of me, their arrogance was complete. They thought the years of humiliation had softened me into someone harmless. They thought endurance was weakness. They thought wrong. Looking back, the signs had been there long before the cocktail. They came in small doses scattered across the months, but once pieced together, the picture was clear. It started with Simone's sudden fascination with my financial affairs. She had never asked about my accounts before, but recently she began weaving the subject into casual conversations. One evening after dinner, she leaned across the table with that polished smile and asked if I had considered consolidating my investments. Another time, she pressed about my house, suggesting that maintaining a property of that size must be a lot for one person. Each comment was dressed as concern, but her eyes told a different story. She wasn't asking, she was assessing. Gregory, meanwhile, had begun to change. My oldest son had always been thoughtful, the kind to call just to check in, the kind to ask me for advice even when he didn't need it. But those calls became rare. When we did talk, his words felt rehearsed, like someone had coached him before he picked up the phone. He asked less about me and more about what I was planning for the future. He didn't even notice the way I paused before answering, testing him to see if he'd push harder. He never did. He was playing his part, likely without realizing it. Walter kept his role the same, but the barb sharpened. At Marcus's son's birthday party, he clapped me on the shoulder and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You know, Henry, there comes a time when old men need to step aside before they drag everyone else down. Laughter followed, though it wasn't the kind that came from joy. It was the uneasy kind, the kind people use when they don't know how else to respond. Simone laughed the hardest, her hand resting lightly on Gregory's arm, sealing the moment with approval. Another evening, at Simone and Gregory's home, Walter leaned across the table during dessert and asked if I had anyone to help with my bills these days. The question was framed as innocent, but it carried a sting I couldn't miss. Simone shot him a quick look, the kind that was supposed to be disapproval, but it was gone too quickly. She wasn't stopping him. She was letting him set the stage. I began to notice how Simone positioned herself during family discussions. If Marcus asked me about something, a memory from childhood, a piece of advice, Simone would step in with her own opinion, subtly shifting attention back to herself. When I tried to share details about my pension or my plans, she would nod politely, but always follow up with Gregory later, away from me. Individually, these moments could have been dismissed. Families shift, sons lean on their wives, fathers-in-law endure jokes. But stacked together, the pattern was undeniable. Simone was circling my finances. Gregory was pulling away. Walter was painting me as a man slipping into decline. That was when suspicion hardened into certainty. They weren't waiting for me to falter. They were preparing to make me falter. The picture was clear. A campaign to position me as incapable, to justify stepping in, to turn concern into control. The night Simone placed that drink in front of me, it wasn't a surprise. It was simply the first bold move after months of careful setup, and it told me I had been right all along. The more I replayed the dinner in my mind, the clearer the intention became. Simone hadn't wanted me gone. Not yet. If that drink had carried poison, Walter would have done more than slump and sweat. No, what he drank was meant to weaken, not kill. It was designed for confusion, for clumsiness, for the kind of episode that could be explained away as age catching up. The hospital confirmed it when I later overheard Gregory telling Marcus that the doctors believed Walter had reacted badly to something mixed with his medication. Simone had fed them that line from the start, sticking close to it until it hardened into fact. It was too tidy, too prepared, and it revealed more than she intended. If Walter had suffered, then whatever had been in my glass was strong enough to trigger exactly the kind of spectacle she'd hoped for. I thought back to her watching me across the table, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. She wasn't waiting for me to collapse in silence. She was waiting for the display, the stumble, the slurred speech, the confused muttering that would leave Gregory and Marcus whispering later about their father not being himself anymore. Walter's collapse was never part of her script, but his reaction showed me what she had planned for me. It wasn't just a drink. It was groundwork, an attempt to push the family toward a single conclusion, that I was no longer capable of managing my life, my home, or my finances. And when the subject of guardianship came, it would come through Gregory. He was the oldest son, Simone's husband, the natural choice for responsibility. Once his name was on my accounts, the doors would open for her. She wouldn't have to lift another finger. She would control everything through him. The pieces fell into place when Marcus visited me a few days later. He sat in my living room, his voice low, careful not to be overheard even though no one else was around. "Simone's been hinting to Greg that you need more help," he said. "She's talking about doctors, evaluations. She's laying out slow, Dad." That was the confirmation I needed. The special cocktail wasn't the end. It was the opening act. They hadn't planned on Walter being the one to showcase the effects, but even that worked in their favor. They could spin it as proof of their vigilance, their readiness to intervene in a crisis. All it would take was another staged episode, another evening where I seemed unwell, and their case would be strong enough to move forward. I understood then that I wasn't fighting an accident or even one attempt. I was fighting a campaign, a quiet one, crafted through manipulation, stage concern, and the slow rewriting of family perception. For years, they had tried to humiliate me with words. Now, they were ready to humiliate me with evidence. And once the family believed it, undoing the damage would be nearly impossible. That drink told me everything. Simone and Walter didn't want me dead. They wanted me powerless. The easy thing would have been to confront them right away. I could have called Simone out that very night, told Gregory what I saw, laid bare the switch of glasses and the result. But that would have only sparked denial, excuses, and family fractures without proof. Words alone wouldn't hold. I knew them well enough to understand that. They'd twist it, flip it, and turn the blame back on me. So I chose a different path. I would let them think their plan was working. It began with small adjustments. At the grocery store, I asked the clerk to repeat the total, then pretended to fumble with the bills longer than usual. Around the house, I forgot where I'd set down my reading glasses. Once, when Marcus came by, I let my hand tremble just enough while pouring coffee that he quietly reached to steady the cup. I thanked him with a weary smile, knowing full well that word would travel back through Simone before the day was over. I could see how quickly they picked it up. Gregory started speaking to me with a softness that wasn't natural, a careful tone people use with children or the frail. Simone would ask if I'd remember to take my pills, though she knew I wasn't on any. And Walter, recovered enough to rejoin the table weeks later, looked at me with a smirk I hadn't seen before, as if he thought the game was already won. Every gesture they made told me the same thing. They believed the cracks were real. They believed I was fading. And the more convinced they grew, the sloppier they became. They didn't realize I was listening, watching, memorizing every detail. At night, I practiced stillness. I steadied my hands until they didn't shake. I read through bank statements line by line, and I kept my mind sharp with puzzles and notes. What they saw in daylight was a performance. Behind closed doors, nothing had changed. It wasn't easy. Pride fought me at every step. To sit in silence while Walter's jokes cut deeper, to let Simone guide conversations like she owned the room, to nod along while Gregory repeated her talking points. It burned. But each time I bit back the urge to lash out, I reminded myself, proof mattered more than pride. The charade bought me time. Time to see how far they go. Time to prepare. And most importantly, time to turn their arrogance into evidence. They thought they were watching me fade. In truth, I was watching them tighten their own noose. Once I knew what they were trying to build around me, I started building my own foundation beneath them. Quietly, methodically, I began to move pieces they didn't know existed. My first stop was an old colleague turned attorney who handled estate work for men like me. Not flashy, but thorough. I made an appointment under the pretext of updating my will. We sat in his office for 2 hours, and I laid everything out, my assets, my suspicions, and my plans for protecting what I had built. By the time I left, every document had been revised. Marcus, not Gregory, now stood as my legal safeguard and executor. A trust was drafted for my grandchildren, bypassing Simone entirely. Access to my accounts was fortified behind layers of security they couldn't touch without my say-so. Next, I gathered every scrap of paper connected to my finances and property. Bank statements, deeds, insurance policies, anything they might try to use or twist. I sorted and stored them where only I knew, then scanned digital copies onto an encrypted drive. Nothing was left in the open anymore. Back at home, I began a second phase. I bought a handful of discrete audio recorders, the kind small enough to slip under a table or inside a lamp base. Each time Simone or Walter visited, I had one running. They thought they were entering the same house as before. In truth, it had become a living archive. Their voices, their plans, their little slips of confidence would no longer evaporate after they left. They would sit on files I could hand to a lawyer or a judge if needed. I also spoke quietly with Marcus, not to spill everything, not yet, but to make sure he understood my wishes if anything happened to me. We went over my accounts, my insurance, my healthcare directives. I gave him sealed envelopes he wasn't to open unless I said so. He didn't ask questions. He had seen enough to know something was coming. Meanwhile, in daylight, the performance continued. My hand shook over coffee cups. I asked for reminders about small details. Simone smiled wider each time, convinced she was winning. Walter had returned to his seat at family dinners, smirking at me between stories. Gregory hovered between them, still silent, still distant. But while they played their part, I was assembling a record they couldn't rewrite. Every visit, every suggestion, every subtle push toward guardianship. It was all there now, time-stamped and unchangeable. I didn't rush. Each move I made was slow, deliberate, invisible. By the time they realized the trap had been set, it would already be too late to step back out of it. The shift in Simone's strategy came quietly, but it was impossible to miss. She no longer masked her interest in my affairs with idle chatter. Now, she spoke with Gregory in tones meant to carry just enough for others to overhear. At a Sunday dinner, I listened from the far end of the table as she leaned toward him. "Your dad seems so forgetful lately," she murmured, her voice dripping with stage concern. "What if he misplaces something important? He really should have someone helping him." Gregory nodded absently, not committing but not disagreeing either. That was all she needed. The silence became her permission. Soon after, she began pushing harder. One evening, she mentioned to Gregory within my earshot that she'd read about elder guardianship being a loving way to protect aging parents from making mistakes. She said it lightly, as if it were an offhand idea, but her eyes darted toward me, waiting for a reaction. I gave her none. She wanted resistance to build her case. I gave her quiet. Walter picked up where she left off. His remarks became sharper, more pointed. "Henry, you ever think about how much risk you take keeping all that money in your own hands?" he asked one night, his smile smug. "It only takes one bad signature, one scam phone call, and poof, gone." His words weren't advice. They were bricks in the wall he and Simone were building, each comment designed to paint me as a man teetering on the edge of incompetence. Together, they formed a rhythm. Simone whispered the language of concern. Walter delivered the blunt warnings. Gregory, caught between them, started repeating their words back to me in small doses. "Dad, maybe you should let me look over your accounts, just in case," he suggested one afternoon on the porch. His voice was careful, not confrontational, but it carried the weight of someone else's influence. I watched it unfold without breaking character. I nodded slowly, thanked him for his thoughtfulness, and returned to the quiet performance I had been giving them for weeks. My hands trembled as I set down my glass. I asked him to remind me of a story I'd told him before, as if I'd forgotten. His concern deepened, and I could see Simone's satisfaction when Gregory later recounted the moment at dinner, her smile blooming as though the evidence was stacking exactly as she'd planned. The seed she planted began to sprout quickly. Gregory spoke less like a son and more like a guardian in waiting. Walter smirked more openly, confident the outcome was inevitable. And Simone? She moved through rooms like a woman rehearsing for a role she was sure she had already secured. But all the while, the recorders hummed in silence, capturing every word. Thanksgiving had always been my wife's favorite holiday, and though she was gone, I kept the tradition alive. This year, the table was set at Gregory and Simone's home, every detail arranged to perfection. Candles lined the center. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air, and laughter echoed from the kitchen where the grandchildren played. But beneath it all, there was tension humming like a wire pulled tight. I took my seat near the end of the table, the spot Simone always steered me toward, and let the evening play out. Conversation was easy enough, small talk about work, school, and the weather, but I noticed the way Simone hovered behind Gregory's chair, hand resting lightly on his shoulder, guiding him as she always did. Walter sat tall at the opposite end, pouring himself glass after glass of wine, his voice booming above the others. Dinner carried on without incident until plates were cleared and most of the family moved into the living room for dessert. I lingered, claiming I needed a moment to rest my legs. From where I sat, I could hear voices drift in from the kitchen. Walter and Simone had stayed behind. Walter's tone was smug, careless with confidence. "Soon enough, the old man will be right where we want him," he said, his words rolling out between sips of wine. He chuckled, low and satisfied, the kind of laugh that came from someone who believed victory was already certain. Simone didn't argue. She didn't caution him about being overheard. She simply agreed, her voice sharper than she likely intended. "It's only a matter of time. Gregory's coming around, and once the papers are in order, it'll all be settled." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my breathing measured. The words carried clear through the doorway, each one etching itself into memory. They weren't hints or passing suggestions anymore. They were admissions, plain and direct. The sound of Simone stacking plates followed, then Walter laughing again, this time quieter, as if savoring the thought of me diminished, stripped of control. Their voices faded as they joined the others, masks back in place, smiles practiced for the family. When Simone handed me a slice of pie later, her face bright with hostess charm, I met her eyes and held them for a beat longer than usual. She looked away first. The evening ended as it always did. Hugs at the door, promises to call soon, grandchildren running out into the night with coats half zipped. But for me, the night had already delivered what I needed. I had heard it with my own ears, their conspiracy sealed in their own words. I didn't react. I didn't let on. Instead, I filed those sentences away with everything else I had gathered. Thanksgiving had given me more than a meal. It had given me confirmation. Walter had built his identity on the myth of being untouchable. Every gathering, he polished the same story. The sharp banker who outsmarted markets, the man who secured wealth through clever investments, the patriarch whose judgment was never wrong. But I knew better. Years back, when I was still working, I'd crossed paths with contractors who whispered about Walter's dealings. Shady loan structures, backroom partnerships, and quiet failures swept under rugs too heavy for most men to lift. He wasn't the financial genius he pretended to be. He was a man who survived by cutting corners. Those corners were still out there, waiting to be traced. So while Simone and Gregory rehearsed their guardianship campaign, I opened old files. In a shoebox at the back of my closet, I had kept receipts, correspondence, and notes from years of watching Walter brag in circles. Among them were letters about a failed investment group, one he had propped up with other people's money before letting it sink. The paper trail was messy, but it was enough to raise questions in the right hands. I didn't confront him directly. I didn't need to. Instead, I packaged the documents with care, highlighted the suspicious transfers, and sent them quietly to the state regulators. Anonymously. No signature, no fingerprints, just enough substance to make them look twice at the man who bragged too loudly. The ripples came faster than even I expected. Within weeks, Walter was receiving letters instead of sending them. Calls that once ended in backslaps now ended in clipped tones. His wine-soaked laughter at dinners grew forced, covering for the unease creeping in from the edges of his empire. By the time the new year turned, the whispers had reached his own circles. Associates pulled away, invitations dried up, and those who once laughed with him started to laugh at him. He wasn't untouchable anymore. He was vulnerable. And for a man who had built his entire persona on power, vulnerability was worse than silence. I watched it all unfold without a word. At dinners, his voice lost its edge. His jokes about me faded, replaced by mutters about regulators, overreaching, and petty men who didn't understand the business. Simone, for all her poise, began to glance at him differently. Her anchor was slipping, and though she tried to mask it, the cracks showed. The proud banker who had once lorded over me with smugness was unraveling under the weight of his own history. And I didn't need to raise my voice, didn't need to break the mask. All I had to do was let the truth he buried claw its way back into daylight. Walter's collapse had begun, and it was only the first stone pulled from their wall. Walter's troubles were mounting, though Simone did everything she could to pretend otherwise. She held her posture at family dinners, smiled through conversations, and leaned on Gregory with the same practiced ease she always had. But beneath that polish, her focus had shifted. With her father distracted by regulators and bad press, she doubled down on the plan that mattered most to her, me. It started with gentle nudges. Over coffee one afternoon, she told Gregory that I'd looked exhausted at Thanksgiving. It's not fair to expect him to keep up with all that paperwork, the house, the bills, she said, her voice layered with concern. Gregory frowned, but didn't argue. That silence gave her confidence. Soon, she was drawing up lists. She suggested that Gregory prepare by gathering documents, just in case something happened. She pointed out stories she'd read online about seniors being scammed out of their savings. "We can't let that happen to your dad," she said, pressing the idea that guardianship wasn't betrayal. It was responsibility. Gregory, worn thin by her persistence, began testing the waters with me. He asked if I needed help balancing my accounts. He offered to hire someone to manage repairs on the house. His words were careful, but they carried Simone's fingerprints. When I brushed him off politely, he looked relieved. He wasn't ready to confront me outright. But Simone wasn't looking for readiness. She was looking for compliance. And she was certain she would get it. By mid-January, she had papers in her possession. Draft forms for guardianship, not yet filed but ready to be. She presented them to Gregory one evening after the children went to bed. "It's time," she told him, sliding the folder across the table. "He's slipping, Greg. You've seen it. We're only doing what's best." Gregory hesitated, but Simone's persistence had a way of grinding down resistance. She played to his sense of duty, reminded him of his role as the eldest son, and framed it as a necessary sacrifice. "Your father needs you, even if he doesn't realize it." She didn't see the weakness in her position. She didn't notice the tension in Gregory's voice when he spoke to Marcus. She didn't recognize that Walter's reputation was crumbling too quickly to serve as a shield. In her mind, I was already halfway out of control, and the family would back her when the time came. What she didn't know was that every word of her insistence, every push she made, was being quietly recorded. And while she prepared guardianship papers in secret, I was preparing something stronger. Her confidence wasn't just arrogance. It was blindness. And blindness would cost her more than she could imagine. The meeting was supposed to be routine. At least, that's how Simone presented it to Gregory when she convinced him to schedule it. A quiet sit-down at their home with papers ready, a lawyer on call, and family gathered to do what was best. She expected me to arrive fragile, hesitant, maybe confused. Instead, I walked in steady, coat buttoned, eyes clear, carrying a folder under my arm. Gregory looked uneasy from the moment I entered. He shifted in his chair, eyes darting between me and Simone, as if he knew the weight of what he'd agreed to. Simone, on the other hand, was radiant with confidence. She placed a neat stack of forms in the center of the table, slid a pen beside them, and gave me the kind of smile she usually saved for neighbors and church acquaintances. "Dad, this is just a formality," she said. "We want to make sure you're protected." I sat down slowly, placed my folder on the table, and let the silence stretch. Then I reached inside and pulled out a small recorder. I clicked play. Walter's voice filled the room first, smug and careless. "Soon enough, the old man will be right where we want him." Simone's reply followed, sharp and certain. "It's only a matter of time. Gregory's coming around, and once the papers are in order, it'll all be settled." The words crackled through the speaker, each one undeniable. Gregory's face drained of color. He turned to his wife, his mouth half open, but Simone's composure cracked for the first time. Her eyes darted to me, then to the recorder, then back to Gregory. She stammered, searching for an explanation, but I cut her off with a shuffle of more papers. From my folder, I laid out copies of regulatory complaints, highlighting Walter's past mismanagement, the failed ventures, the questionable transfers. Dates, amounts, signatures, all lined in black and white. I pushed them across the table. "This," I said evenly, "is the man you've been trusting to guide your wife. And this," I tapped the recorder, "is what they've been planning behind closed doors." Walter's name was already sinking under the weight of scrutiny, and here was proof of why. Simone's hands trembled as she tried to gather the papers, but Gregory stopped her, pulling them back toward himself. He scanned the pages, his jaw tightening with every line. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Gregory's gaze shifted from the papers to Simone, then to me. He didn't speak at first, but the look in his eyes was enough. He was seeing his wife clearly, maybe for the first time. Simone tried to recover, her voice cracking as she insisted it was taken out of context, that she was only worried about my health, that Walter's past had nothing to do with his advice today. But her words rang hollow against the recordings and documents spread across the table. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. The truth sat between us, undeniable and damning. When the meeting ended, the guardianship papers remained untouched. Simone's confidence had evaporated, and Gregory was left staring at the wreckage of her betrayal. I gathered my folder, tucked it neatly under my arm, and walked out without looking back. The trap had been sprung. In the days after the meeting, Simone's presence around me dimmed. The bright smiles, the hovering concern, the carefully chosen words, all gone. She avoided me at gatherings, speaking only when necessary, her eyes hard but her voice subdued. Gregory kept his distance too, no longer pressing me with questions about my future. He was caught between shame and silence, and for once, he had nothing rehearsed to say. It was the right moment to make my next move. I called the family together at my house, Marcus included, and told them plainly that I wanted no more whispers about my affairs. If there were questions, I would answer them directly. Simone crossed her arms as I spoke, clearly expecting me to backpedal, to soothe the tension. Instead, I opened the folder I had brought out once before, but this time the contents were different. "These are my estate documents," I said, laying the first page flat on the table. "They've already been signed and filed." Simone's eyes flicked up at that word. Filed, as if hoping I was bluffing. I wasn't. I pushed the pages toward Gregory and Marcus so they could read for themselves. Marcus scanned quickly, his brow furrowed, but his posture steady. Gregory lingered longer, his face tightening with every line. The revisions were clear. Simone's name was absent, completely. Where once she might have stood to benefit indirectly through Gregory, now her access was severed. More than that, I had placed stipulations on Gregory's share. "You'll inherit only if you are no longer married to Simone at the time of my passing," I explained, watching his expression shift from disbelief to quiet anger. "That's not punishment. That's protection. For you and for this family." Marcus looked up from the papers, his eyes meeting mine. He said nothing, but the relief on his face told me he understood exactly why I had done it. I continued, Marcus is named executor. He will oversee all matters, financial and otherwise, to ensure there's no interference. And the grandchildren's future is secure through a trust that cannot be touched by anyone but them. The room fell into silence. Simone sat rigid, her hands gripping the edge of the chair, her face a mask barely holding together. Gregory exhaled slowly, the weight of what he'd read pressing on him. He knew his wife had lost her footing, and with her, so had he. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply gathered the pages, tucked them back into the folder, and placed it on the mantel where it would remain visible as a reminder. The message was delivered. Their campaign was finished before it had truly begun. By the time they left my house that evening, Simone's silence spoke louder than any argument. She had been erased from my future, and no amount of scheming could write her back in. Walter's downfall accelerated faster than even I anticipated. The regulators who had once hesitated now pressed harder, sending letters, issuing subpoenas, and opening hearings into the investment schemes he had buried years ago. The same men who once slapped him on the back at social clubs now refused to take his calls. His voice, once booming and certain, grew clipped and defensive. The man who had ridiculed me for decades was suddenly struggling to defend himself against questions he couldn't laugh away. Simone tried to steady him at first, showing up at his house with binders, notes, and assurances. But her patience thinned as Walter's name dragged further into scandal. Whispers spread, lawsuits, potential fraud, talk of restitution. The image of the successful banker was gone, replaced by the portrait of a man desperate to protect what little he had left. And Simone, who had built so much of her confidence on her father's standing, began to pull away. At the same time, her marriage to Gregory buckled under the weight of what I had revealed. Gregory couldn't shake the recordings, his wife's voice plotting behind his back, conspiring with Walter to strip his own father of dignity and control. Every time Simone opened her mouth to explain, the words rang hollow. At dinners, his silence became longer, his eyes harder. Arguments erupted behind closed doors, their voices carrying down hallways they thought were private. The trust between them had splintered, and no amount of excuses could repair it. The alliance that had once seemed unshakable began to fracture in plain view. Walter, drowning in his own legal battles, grew resentful of Simone for abandoning him when he needed her most. Simone, desperate to salvage her marriage, tried to distance herself from his troubles. What had once been a coordinated campaign against me devolved into finger-pointing. Walter blamed Simone for pushing too fast, for mishandling Gregory. Simone blamed Walter for being reckless and careless enough to get caught. Gregory, caught in the middle, was left humiliated. His wife had betrayed him, his father-in-law had deceived him, and his own father had proven stronger than the both of them combined. The shame hollowed him out, leaving him a shell of the confident man he once thought himself to be. Through it all, I remained untouched. I kept to my routines, greeted my grandchildren, and maintained my home. Where Walter's name was dragged through hearings and Simone's marriage cracked under strain, mine remained steady, unshaken. Their power had collapsed inward, crushing them from the inside. The family that once sought to corner me was now cornered by their own making, and I didn't have to lift another finger. When I think back on how it all began, it still comes down to a single moment. One glass placed in front of me, one smile stretched a little too wide, one decision made in silence. I could have raised the alarm, I could have pointed a finger, but instead I moved the glass an inch to the left. That inch changed everything. From that moment forward, the balance shifted. Simone, so certain of her control, unraveled in her own overconfidence. Walter, so proud of his reputation, watched it collapse under truths he could no longer hide. Gregory, once caught between them, was left staring at betrayal he hadn't expected to come from his own wife. And me? I remained steady, watching the empire they built crumble without ever laying a hand on it. It wasn't noise or confrontation that exposed them. It wasn't shouting matches or accusations across the table. It was the quiet patience of waiting, letting them write their own downfall word by word, move by move. Now the family sits differently. Marcus carries responsibility with clarity. My grandchildren are secured for the future, and the whispers that once cut me down at dinners have fallen silent. Simone no longer speaks in my presence. Walter no longer mocks. Gregory no longer boasts. The tables have turned, and I didn't have to trade dignity to see it happen. All it took was one night, one drink, and one choice.